Please note, this first story is from a female's perspective. This actually happened to me when I was a kid. I'm a girl, and I was 8 years old when this happened. I grew up with my mum and my stepfather in an apartment in Chicago at the time. My stepfather was a crackhead. I'm pretty certain he used every day. He was a pretty good father, considering he was high all the time. I felt way closer to him than my mum. We spent tons of time together after his morning walks. His habit got really bad. My mother was the only one who could work because he kept getting fired. At the time, my mother had just got some new furniture, a whole living room set, 2 couches, lamps, end tables, rugs. She even got a new TV. She was pretty proud and happy, mainly because she was able to hide enough money away from my stepfather to buy everything. A few days after she bought everything, my mum and I went to Burger King. We came back to the apartment. My mother opened the door, and her smile dropped. There was absolutely nothing in the living room. She told me to check my things. My bike, all my video games, my TV and my clarinet were all gone as well. There were quite a few other things gone from the apartment. You already know who the culprit is. My stepfather. Apparently, he owed some people money for drugs. He said he had no choice. He had to either pay up now, or it'll be everything he loves. As you see, his habit was very, very bad. Now to the meat of the story. One day, I woke up to my stepfather calling me. It was pretty early. The sun was just starting to peek into my room. I got up and I heard him in the kitchen talking to someone frantically. I couldn't hear much because my door was closed, but I remember making out a little bit. He said, "Man, she's beautiful. You won't be disappointed." I slipped on my house shoes, trying to figure out who he was talking to. I heard one response, but the voice was very deep, so I couldn't understand what was said. It was strange for someone to be visiting our apartment, and especially strange since it was so early. I was tired, confused, and a bit annoyed at being woken up. I opened my door. From it, I have a straight line of sight to the kitchen. I see my stepfather nervously fidgeting, pacing, and talking. He saw me and said, "Ah, here she is, man." I stood in my doorway and tried to give him a look of, "Who the hell are you talking to?" He motioned for me to come in. I walk into the kitchen, and I see a tall, older white man wearing shades. Looking back, I assume he was in his late 40s. He was balding, he had a short beard, and he was dressed very nicely. My father said, "Here she is. What do you think?" My parents tended to show me off to people, so this wasn't odd to me. The man looked at me, I assume through his shades, and then looked back at my stepfather. My stepfather had the most nervous smile on his face that I have ever seen. My father told me to give a twirl. I wasn't going to twirl in front of this strange guy, and definitely not this early. So he forcefully turned me. He held my nightgown taut, so it was fitting against my body, and said, "Not bad, right?" I pushed his hand off me. This was clearly very, very strange now. I didn't understand what was going on, but I knew something wrong was happening. The entire time, the white man said nothing. He just stared at me. My stepfather then told me, "You're going to have to go with him now." I frowned and asked why, but before I could really start, the white man spoke. He squatted down to my height, smiled, and asked, "How old are you?" Nervously, I said, "I'm 8. "Huh. You're a big girl then. Do you like school?" I replied, "I love school." This conversation, and his smile, made me feel a little more at ease. I look over the man's shoulder, and I see my stepfather frowning and glaring at me. This scared me. I have never seen him with that look on his face, except at suspicious people to warn them not to mess with him. I keep looking back at my stepfather, trying to answer the man's questions, and knowing that I said something wrong from my stepfather's reaction. The white guy glances back at my stepfather while still squatted down to my height. My stepfather looks away in fear. The man stands up, looks back down to me, and says, "It was nice talking to you. You're a very smart young lady. Now, go on back to bed." I wasn't used to anyone giving me orders, except at school or my parents. But I knew not to question this guy, and I walked off back to my room. I looked back, and he was watching me. I stood inside my room at the door, and looked back again. He said, "Close your door and go back to bed." I looked at him, and he smiled back at me, and motioned for me to go on. I closed the door and sat on my bed. I hear the man say something to my father in an angry voice. I hear my stepfather begging very loudly, "Please, please take her." The kitchen has a door leading to the outside staircase. My window was pretty close to it. I hear the kitchen door open, so I slid my window open a crack. I hear my stepfather repeatedly begging, "Please, please." The man yells at him, "She's a fucking kid." I tried to peek out to see the staircase. There were 2 other large men standing there near the door on the stairs. I then presume that the white guy punched my stepfather. I couldn't fully see the whole scene, but I heard a thump inside and outside, and I suppose that was from him falling. The white guy and the 2 men walked down the stairs to a nice black car parked in the alley. I hear the kitchen door close, and soon after, my bedroom door opens. My stepfather is drenched in sweat. He smiles at me sheepishly, and then casually says not to tell my mother. I just stared at him. He then asked, did I want to go to the park? I said no. He walked away and left the apartment. I sat there trying to put the pieces together. It clicked that my own stepfather was trying to sell me, more than likely to pay off a huge drug debt. Then everything else fell into place. The strange, oddly friendly white man considered taking me. Why would he take me? What would he have done with me? Where would I go? What about my mum? Feelings of fear, anger, and sadness flooded over me. I laid there and cried for hours, thinking about how close I was to never seeing my mum again, and that my stepfather had planned to do this to me. My mother eventually leaves him some years later. I still haven't told her about this, afraid she might lose it. I'm 26 years old now, and it's still hard to think about this without crying. Please note that this final story has been verified by the official moderators of the subreddit Let's Not Meet through evidence submitted by the original poster. My mum left my dad when I was 9. I have 3 older sisters. My dad was an abusive alcoholic. He used to beat us all, especially my mother. He would twist hickory switches together and bake them in the oven before beating us with them. My mum finally got the courage to leave. We stayed in a shelter for a while for abused women and their children. After my mum saved up enough money for us to move, we moved into a mobile home. Our first night in our new place, 2 of my sisters and I are watching TV. My mum was in the kitchen, and my oldest sister was cleaning out the bathtub. My dad came through the door and put his finger to his mouth, saying, "Shh." We were very afraid of him, so we didn't say anything. He went into the kitchen and said, "Carrie." My mum turned around, and he showed her a gun. She screamed and ran down the hall towards the back door. He told her if she didn't stop screaming, he would kill the kids as well. My 2 sisters and I ran out the front door to our neighbor's house. We told them what was happening when it dawned on us that our older sister was still inside. She managed to escape about a minute later. When she heard our dad's voice, she laid down in the tub. My dad shot my mum 5 times, killing her. My oldest sister said he went back down the hall, calling our names. That's when she jumped up and ran out. I'm 38 now, and he's still in prison.
Back when I was a kid, I had this friend in elementary school. We were super close, sat next to each other in class, hung out every recess and lunch. So, at one point, we planned a little sleepover. My parents' place was kind of small at the time, but she lived in this big old house with her grandparents, so it was arranged we'd have our sleepover there instead. I never found out why she lived with them or where her parents were, but I distinctly remember my mom and dad telling me not to ask her questions about them, for obvious reasons in hindsight. The only thing was, my friend seemed really set on having the sleepover at my place. I mean, to the point where, when we had no choice but to have it at her grandparents' place, she seemed to not want to have a sleepover anymore. I had to convince her to have it at her place just because I was so excited about the idea of having the sleepover in general. Anyways, it comes to the night of the sleepover. I go over to her grandparents' place, and it's every bit as fun as I imagined. We watched movies up in her room, had pizza delivered, ate ice cream right out of the tub, and her grandparents seemed really sweet and nice. Then I think it was around 9 p.m. Her grandpa knocks on the door, pokes his head in, and tells us that he and my friend's grandma are headed to bed, so we're to keep the noise down. We're like, okay, good night. He leaves, and we carry on with our night. A little while after, I get up and head over to the door, telling my friend I needed to use the bathroom. She jumps up, throws herself between me and the door, and is like, "You can't go out there. You'll wake up Grandpa." I tell her not to worry and that I'd creep down the hall on tippy toes so as not to wake him, but my friend still refuses to let me leave the room. I think she's actually playing around for a second. I'm like, "Quit it," and try to get past her, but she actually shoves me back away from the door with this angry look on her face. I didn't want to start a fight with her, after all. The whole objective was to keep as quiet as possible, but still I needed to use the bathroom. So I asked her where I'm going to go, and get this. She reaches under her bed and pulls out one of the plastic stationery trays. You know, like the inbox and outbox kind you put paper in? Yeah, that kind. She points at this paper tray and is just like, "Go in this." Again, I think she might be playing a weird and cruel sort of trick on me, but she's deadly serious. She actually wanted me to pee in that stationery tray. So I did. It was super gross, but I did it, and instantly, the mood is just destroyed. I had nothing to clean myself up with. I'm pretty sure I peed a little on my nightgown. It was just all kinds of disgusting. But still, my friend won't let me go to use the bathroom to wash up. The weirdest thing was, she acted like it was normal. She never did anything like that at my house, and she definitely didn't seem like that kind of kid, like she wasn't known as the stinky kid in school or whatever. The whole thing just kind of blew my mind, and although I didn't let it affect our relationship or friendship or anything, I definitely didn't like to stay over at her house again. We stayed close for a long time after, but ended up going to different high schools because she moved in with her aunt over in St. Paul. We kept in touch using MySpace, back when that was still a thing, but I never got to the bottom of her weird nocturnal bathroom habits, not until well after her grandpa passed away. When he died, she seemed to take it really bad. When I called her, she broke down crying so bad that she had to hang up, and she wouldn't return any of my texts, no matter how much I begged her to get in touch. In the end, me and my mom looked up her aunt's home phone number and called ahead before we drove over. The aunt seemed more than happy to talk to us, but with the caveat that she had something very, very serious to tell us. My friend's grandpa had been doing stuff to her. Whenever her grandma was asleep, she got up to use the bathroom or whatever, her grandpa would hear her come out of his room and, God, I can't even bring myself to say it. Turns out he'd done the exact same thing to her mom too, and that's like half the reason she wasn't in the picture anymore. One of the other reasons was the drug use, which is why no matter how much she insisted on custody not being given to the grandparents, a judge ignored her and did it anyway. I think they were just so terrified of him that they just couldn't talk about it, ever, and it was only after he died that it all came spilling out in various forms. The aunt that she was living with was her mom's cousin, so obviously wasn't around for what was happening when they were kids. It was absolutely horrifying hearing about it just as her friend, so I can only imagine how terrible the aunt felt, knowing she was so close to the abuse but just not being able to see it. And then it all made sense to me. Why she didn't want me walking down the hall at night. Why she'd taken to peeing in a stationery tray that she kept hidden under her bed. She wasn't being mean or weird when she made me do it. She was protecting me. No wonder she didn't want me to have this sleepover in her place, and I'm really not trying to make this whole thing about me when I say this, but I feel horribly guilty for not saying anything to my parents at the time. I didn't want to embarrass her. She was my friend. My best friend. But that's just the thing about being a kid, isn't it? That naivety. You do dumb stuff even if you don't mean to. And that's what my therapist tells me anyway, and I try to believe it. I really do. But part of me will forever remain convinced that somehow I'm kind of to blame, too.